Silence. Judge Robert Harrison's gavel crashes down like a gunshot. I will not tolerate this disrespect in my courtroom. Sarah Washington stands frozen at the prosecutor's table, evidence scattered across the floor where Harrison just swept it with his hand. Blood trickles from her lip where his ring caught her face during the violent gesture. Another affirmative action hire thinking she can waltz in here, Harrison snarls, spittle flying from his mouth. Your Honor, I have the right to... Sarah begins. You have no rights in here. Harrison explodes from the bench. Bailiff, this woman is disrupting federal proceedings. Sarah clutches the crucial evidence folder against her chest as two officers move toward her. Judge Harrison, you're making a serious mistake. The only mistake is letting people like you into law school. His voice echoes off marble walls. Remove her, now. Spectators gasp. Lawyers freeze. The stenographer's hands shake over her machine. Sir, please. Sarah's voice cracks as hands grab her arms. Get your hands off me! Sarah shouts as bailiffs drag her toward the door. Harrison pounds his gavel repeatedly. Contempt of court. Contempt. I want her arrested. Sarah's briefcase crashes to the floor, papers exploding everywhere. She struggles against the officers, her suit jacket tearing. You don't understand who you're... I don't care if you're the president's daughter, Harrison screams. Security, call Chicago PD. I want this woman in handcuffs. More hands grab her. The courtroom erupts in chaos. Stop! Sarah's voice cuts through the mayhem like a blade. Everyone freezes. She breaks free from the bailiff's grip, yanks her federal credentials from her jacket, and slams them on the defendant's table. Judge Robert Harrison, you are under arrest for judicial corruption, obstruction of justice, and assault on a federal officer. The badge gleams under courtroom lights. Chief Federal Judge, Northern District of Illinois. Harrison's face goes white as death. That's impossible. FBI, nobody move! Agents flood the courtroom from every entrance, weapons drawn, as America's most powerful judge realizes he just attacked his own boss. But to understand how we got to this moment of absolute judicial devastation, we need to go back 6 hours earlier, when Sarah Washington first walked through those courthouse doors with a plan that would expose the deepest corruption in the federal judicial system. CTA combined. If you believe that no one should ever face judicial abuse of power, type justice below. Then comment your country and city. Let's see where people stand against courtroom corruption worldwide. Your participation shows that accountability knows no borders. The morning had started like any other at the Dirksen Federal Building in Chicago. Security guards scanned badges, lawyers hurried through metal detectors, and the machinery of American justice hummed along with its usual bureaucratic rhythm. But hidden beneath this facade of normalcy, a 2-year federal investigation was about to reach its explosive conclusion. Sarah Washington adjusted her conservative black suit as she approached the building's main entrance. For the past 8 months, she had been living a carefully constructed lie. To everyone in this courthouse, she was Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Mitchell, a mid-level prosecutor handling routine corruption cases. Her modest office on the 3rd floor, her unremarkable caseload, even her slightly frayed briefcase, everything had been designed to make her invisible. What none of them knew was that Sarah Washington wasn't just any federal prosecutor. She was the chief federal judge for the Northern District of Illinois, the youngest woman ever appointed to lead one of America's most powerful courts. And today, she was about to spring a trap that had been 2 years in the making. The security guard barely looked up as she passed through the metal detector. "Morning, Miss Mitchell," he mumbled, already focused on the next person in line. Sarah nodded politely, maintaining the persona that had taken months to perfect. Every detail mattered. The way she carried herself with just slightly less confidence than her true position warranted, the careful selection of off-the-rack suits instead of the designer clothes she normally wore, even the choice to drive her personal Honda instead of the official car that came with her real job. As she stepped into the elevator, Sarah caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. The face staring back at her showed none of the tension she felt inside. This was it, the culmination of everything they had worked toward. Operation Clean Bench, the FBI's most ambitious investigation into judicial corruption in decades, was about to reach its climax in courtroom 2506. The elevator climbed steadily toward the 25th floor, each ding marking another step closer to a confrontation that would reshape the federal judiciary. Sarah's hand unconsciously moved to the briefcase at her side, where her real credentials lay hidden beneath a false bottom. Inside that leather case was enough evidence to destroy careers, end judicial appointments, and send some of America's most powerful legal figures to prison for the rest of their lives. But first, she had to survive the next 60 minutes in the courtroom of Judge Robert Harrison, a man who had no idea that his carefully constructed world of corruption and abuse was about to come crashing down around him. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing the marble-lined corridors of the federal courthouse's highest floors. Sarah stepped out into the hallway, where in less than an hour her true identity would be revealed in the most dramatic fashion possible. As she walked toward courtroom 2506, Sarah's mind flashed to the briefing she had received just 12 hours earlier. FBI Director James Morrison had been crystal clear. "Judge Washington, once you enter that courtroom, there's no going back. Harrison will show his true colors, and when he does, you'll have him, but you need to be prepared for anything." Now, standing outside the double doors that led to Harrison's domain, Sarah took a deep breath and prepared to begin the most dangerous performance of her career. The morning air in courtroom 2506 felt electric with tension as Sarah pushed through the heavy oak doors. Judge Robert Harrison was already seated behind his imposing bench, his silver hair perfectly styled, his black robes immaculate. At 58, he commanded the room with the kind of authority that comes from 2 decades of absolute power. But what the packed gallery didn't know was that Harrison's authority was built on a foundation of lies, bribery, and systematic corruption that stretched back 15 years. The FBI had spent 2 years building their case, and Sarah was the final piece of the puzzle. "The court will come to order," Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "We are here today for the preliminary hearing in United States versus Chicago police officers Michael Torres, David Chen, and Robert Martinez." Sarah took her seat at the prosecutor's table, her movements deliberate and measured. Across the aisle, the defense attorneys, 3 of Chicago's most expensive criminal lawyers, arranged their papers with the confidence of men who knew the fix was in. The case was explosive. 3 police officers accused of running a drug trafficking operation that generated over $12 million in illegal profits. What made it even more significant was that their activities were allegedly covered up by corrupt judges who had been taking bribes for years. Harrison's eyes swept across the courtroom, lingering on Sarah with barely concealed contempt. "I see we have a new prosecutor handling this case. Ms. Mitchell, is it?" "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, standing with appropriate deference. "Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Mitchell." "Well, Ms. Mitchell," Harrison's tone dripped with condescension, "I hope you understand that this court operates under very specific standards. We don't tolerate grandstanding or theatrical presentations here." The comment sent a ripple through the gallery. Several veteran court reporters exchanged knowing glances. They had seen Harrison's barely veiled prejudice before, but rarely so openly displayed. Sarah nodded respectfully. "Of course, Your Honor. I'm prepared to present the government's evidence in a straightforward and professional manner." "See that you do." Harrison's gavel tapped once, a sound that seemed to echo with finality. "Now, let's see what the government thinks it has." As Sarah approached the podium, she was acutely aware that every move was being monitored. Hidden in the gallery were 3 FBI agents posing as journalists, their recording equipment disguised as standard courthouse cameras. In the back row, Assistant Director Patricia Reeves sat dressed as a law student, her laptop actually controlling surveillance equipment that was capturing every word, every gesture, every revealing moment of judicial bias. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice clear and confident, "the government will prove that the defendants operated a systematic drug trafficking enterprise that generated over $12 million in profits. Furthermore, we will show that this operation was protected by corrupt officials at the highest levels of—" "Objection!" Defense Attorney Marcus Webb shot to his feet. "Your Honor, the prosecutor is making inflammatory allegations without foundation." Harrison's gavel slammed down before Sarah could respond. "Sustained. Ms. Mitchell, you will confine yourself to the facts of this case. not wild conspiracy theories. Sarah felt the first stirring of the trap being set. Harrison's intervention was premature and legally questionable, exactly the kind of behavior the FBI needed on record. Your Honor, with respect, the government's evidence directly supports these allegations. We have financial records, wiretap conversations, and testimony from Ms. Mitchell. Harrison's voice boomed across the courtroom. I warned you about theatrical presentations. The court will not tolerate prosecutorial misconduct. The accusation of misconduct was serious and completely unfounded. Sarah had done nothing more than outline the government's case, a standard practice in any preliminary hearing. But Harrison's reaction was revealing a pattern of bias that went far beyond normal judicial discretion. In the gallery, Agent Reeves made a subtle hand signal. The recording equipment was capturing everything, including Harrison's facial expressions, tone of voice, and body language. Every word was being preserved for what would become the most significant judicial corruption trial in federal court history. Your Honor, Sarah continued, maintaining her composure despite the judicial attack, perhaps if I could simply present our evidence, perhaps you could learn some respect for this court's authority, Harrison snapped. His face was beginning to flush red, a sign that his famous temper was starting to show. I've been on this bench for 20 years, Ms. Mitchell. I don't need lessons from some diversity hire about how to run my courtroom. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Several spectators gasped audibly. The court reporter's hands paused over her stenotype machine. Even the bailiffs looked uncomfortable. Defense attorney Webb tried to intervene. Your Honor, perhaps we could— Mr. Webb, I can handle this myself. Harrison cut him off. His attention remained fixed on Sarah like a predator studying prey. Miss Mitchell, you seem to have forgotten that this is a federal courtroom, not some community college debate club. When you stand before this bench, you show proper respect. Sarah felt the weight of the moment. Every instinct screamed at her to reveal her true identity, to put this arrogant man in his place immediately. But the investigation required patience. Harrison needed to reveal the full extent of his corruption and bias before the trap could be sprung. I apologize if I've given any offense, Your Honor, she said carefully. I simply wish to present the government's evidence against these defendants. Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the courtroom. Then you better make sure that evidence is rock solid, Ms. Mitchell, because in my court, prosecutors who waste my time face consequences. The threat in Harrison's voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with facing down a bully. But this bully wore judicial robes and commanded one of the most powerful courtrooms in America. Your Honor, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the mounting tension, the government's evidence is indeed comprehensive. We have documented financial transactions showing— Stop right there. Harrison's hand shot up like a traffic cop. Before you continue with these alleged financial records, I want to know how they were obtained. Were proper warrants issued? Were constitutional protections observed? The questions were reasonable on their surface, but Sarah recognized the trap. Harrison was looking for any technical excuse to suppress evidence, regardless of its legitimacy. It was a pattern the FBI had observed in dozens of his cases, selective application of constitutional protections that somehow always benefited defendants who had paid the right bribes. Your Honor, all evidence was obtained through proper legal channels. We have federal search warrants signed by— By which judge? Harrison interrupted sharply. Judge Patricia Morales of the Eastern District, Sarah answered. Harrison's expression darkened. Judge Morales was known for her integrity and her refusal to participate in the corruption network that Harrison had spent years building. Judge Morales, Harrison repeated, his tone suggesting he had just tasted something unpleasant. Well, that explains the sloppy legal work. Ms. Mitchell, I'm concerned about the constitutional implications of this so-called evidence. In the gallery, FBI agent David Torres, disguised as a courthouse security guard, adjusted his position to get a better angle on his hidden camera. Harrison's bias was becoming more obvious with each exchange, and every word was being recorded for posterity. Defense attorney Webb seized the opening. Your Honor, given these concerns about constitutional violations, Perhaps the court should consider suppressing all evidence obtained through these questionable warrants. An excellent point, Mr. Webb. Harrison nodded approvingly. Ms. Mitchell, can you provide this court with absolute assurance that no constitutional rights were violated during your investigation? The demand was impossible to meet in absolute terms, and Harrison knew it. No prosecutor could provide such sweeping assurances without extensive review of every aspect of an investigation. It was a legal catch-22 designed to derail the government's case. Sarah felt the trap closing around her, but she also knew that every unreasonable demand, every biased ruling, was being preserved for the moment of reckoning that was coming. Your Honor, I can assure the court that all investigative procedures followed established constitutional guidelines. However, if the court has specific concerns about particular pieces of evidence, my concern, Ms. Mitchell, is with prosecutors who think they can steamroll through my courtroom without proper preparation. Harrison's voice was rising again. This court demands excellence, not the kind of affirmative action legal work that seems to be increasingly common in federal prosecutors' offices. The second racial reference sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Several attorneys in the gallery began whispering among themselves. The court reporter looked up from her machine with obvious distress. Sarah felt her jaw clench involuntarily. In her real position as chief federal judge, she had spent years fighting against exactly this kind of prejudice in the judicial system, but today she had to endure it for the greater good of the investigation. Your Honor, I would ask that the court judge the evidence on its legal merits rather than what, Ms. Mitchell? Harrison leaned forward aggressively. Are you suggesting that this court is biased? Are you questioning my judicial integrity? The question was a landmine. Any suggestion of bias could be construed as contempt of court, giving Harrison the excuse he needed to remove Sarah from the case, or worse. Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply asking for a fair hearing of the evidence. Fair? Harrison's laugh was cold and bitter. Ms. Mitchell, fairness is exactly what you're getting. But fairness doesn't mean lowering standards to accommodate prosecutors who aren't qualified for federal court. The insult hit its mark, and Sarah felt her composure beginning to crack. But in the back of the courtroom, Agent Reeves gave her an almost imperceptible nod. The recording equipment was capturing everything, including Harrison's increasingly obvious pattern of discrimination. Defense Attorney Webb, sensing an opportunity, stood again. Your Honor, given the prosecutor's apparent inability to meet this court's standards, perhaps the government should consider withdrawing these charges. An interesting suggestion, Mr. Webb, Harrison mused. Miss Mitchell, would you like to reconsider this prosecution? Save yourself and this court the embarrassment of a failed case? Sarah's hands tightened on the podium. The suggestion that she withdraw the charges was both professionally insulting and legally inappropriate. Federal prosecutors don't withdraw major corruption cases based on a judge's personal bias. No, Your Honor, the government intends to proceed with this prosecution based on the strength of our evidence. Evidence that you apparently can't present competently, Harrison shot back. Ms. Mitchell, I'm beginning to wonder if the U.S. Attorney's Office has lost all professional standards. Perhaps I should contact your supervisor about your performance today. The threat was clear and unprecedented. Federal judges don't typically threaten to complain about prosecutors unless there's been serious misconduct, which there hadn't been. Your Honor, I believe I've conducted myself professionally and appropriately. That's not for you to decide, Ms. Mitchell. Professional standards in this courtroom are determined by this court, not by prosecutors who think their diversity credentials entitle them to special treatment. The third racial reference was the most blatant yet. In the gallery, reporters began scribbling frantically in their notebooks. They sensed they were witnessing something unprecedented, a federal judge's career imploding in real time. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine everything. Harrison's mask was slipping, revealing the corrupt, prejudiced man beneath the judicial robes. The trap was almost ready to be sprung. The tension in courtroom 2506 had become almost unbearable. Sarah could feel the eyes of every person in the gallery focused on the brewing confrontation between herself and Judge Harrison. What they didn't know was that they were witnessing the carefully orchestrated final act of the most extensive judicial corruption investigation in federal history. "Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice carrying a new edge of determination, "I believe the court's concerns about the evidence may be resolved if I'm permitted to present the government's most compelling documentation." Harrison's eyes narrowed. "What documentation?" Sarah reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick manila folder. "Financial records that detail systematic payments from known criminal organizations to various court officials over a 15-year period." The folder contained explosive evidence, bank records, wire transfers, and cancelled checks that traced a web of corruption reaching into the highest levels of the federal judiciary. But more importantly, it contained specific evidence of payments made to Robert Harrison himself. Defense Attorney Webb jumped to his feet. "Objection. Your Honor, we've had no discovery regarding these alleged financial records. This is trial by ambush." "Sustained," Harrison said quickly, perhaps too quickly. "Ms. Mitchell." "The court will not allow evidence that hasn't been properly disclosed through discovery procedures." Sarah had anticipated this response. "Your Honor, these records were obtained just 48 hours ago through a federal raid on a Chicago bank. Under Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 16, the government is permitted to disclose evidence as soon as it becomes available." Harrison's face flushed red. "Ms. Mitchell, don't lecture me about criminal procedure. I was interpreting federal rules when you were still in elementary school." The ageist comment, combined with the previous racial references, was building a clear pattern of discriminatory behavior. Agent Reeves, monitoring from the back of the courtroom, made another subtle signal to her recording equipment. "Your Honor," Sarah continued, "these financial records show payments of over $2 million to court personnel, including—" "Enough!" Harrison's gavel crashed down with explosive force. "Ms. Mitchell, you are deliberately trying to disrupt these proceedings with inflammatory allegations." "I'm trying to present evidence of criminal activity," Sarah replied firmly. "Evidence? Or wild conspiracy theories designed to prejudice this court against the defendants?" Harrison's voice was becoming shrill. "Ms. Mitchell, your conduct is approaching the level of prosecutorial misconduct." Sarah felt the moment approaching. Harrison was spiraling, his composure cracking under the pressure of evidence that threatened to expose his own corruption. The trap was almost ready to be sprung. "Your Honor, the government has a responsibility to present all relevant evidence." "The government has a responsibility to follow proper legal procedures." Harrison slammed his hand on the bench. "Something you seem incapable of understanding." "Your Honor, with all due respect—" "Don't you dare lecture me about respect," Harrison exploded. "You walk into my courtroom with your affirmative action attitude, your diversity hire arrogance, and you think you can intimidate this court with unsubstantiated allegations." The fourth racial reference was the most blatant yet. Several spectators gasped audibly. The court reporter's hands trembled over her stenotype machine. Sarah felt her own anger building, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Your Honor, I'm simply attempting to fulfill my duties as a federal prosecutor." "Your duties?" Harrison's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Ms. Mitchell, your only duty right now is to show proper respect for judicial authority. Something they apparently don't teach at whatever second-tier law school you attended." The personal attack crossed another line. Sarah's law degree was from Harvard, where she had graduated magna cum laude before clerking for a Supreme Court justice. But Harrison's assumption about her education revealed his deep-seated prejudices. "Your Honor, I attended Harvard Law School." "Harvard?" Harrison's tone suggested he doubted the claim. "Well, Harvard certainly isn't what it used to be, is it? Lowered standards, quotas, social engineering masquerading as education." In the gallery, veteran court reporter Margaret Klein, who had covered federal courts for 30 years, began shaking her head in disbelief. She had never witnessed such blatant judicial misconduct. Sarah reached for the manila folder again. "Your Honor, regardless of my educational background, the evidence in this case clearly demonstrates—" "Put that folder away," Harrison ordered sharply. "This court will not be subjected to prosecutorial grandstanding based on questionable evidence and inflammatory allegations." "Your Honor, this evidence is directly relevant to the charges." "Ms. Mitchell, you are testing this court's patience." Harrison's face was now deep red. One more outburst and I'll hold you in contempt. Sarah knew she was approaching the critical moment. Harrison's threats were becoming increasingly desperate, his bias more obvious with each exchange. The FBI agents monitoring from the gallery were recording every word, capturing a federal judge's career destruction in real time. Your Honor, I'm not creating outbursts. I'm attempting to present evidence in a federal criminal case. Evidence that you're using to disrupt legal proceedings. Harrison stood behind his bench, his composure completely shattered. Ms. Mitchell, your conduct is a disgrace to the legal profession. Sarah felt the familiar surge of righteous anger. In her true position as chief federal judge, she had dedicated her career to fighting against exactly this kind of corruption and prejudice. The man standing before her represented everything wrong with the judicial system. Your Honor, she said quietly, I believe history will judge who has disgraced the legal profession in this courtroom today. The statement hung in the air like a challenge. Harrison's eyes blazed with fury as he realized that this diversity hire prosecutor was not backing down from his judicial intimidation. What he didn't realize was that in less than 15 minutes, his entire world would collapse around him. Judge Harrison's face had turned an alarming shade of crimson as Sarah's quiet challenge echoed through the silent courtroom. For 20 years, he had ruled his domain with absolute authority, crushing anyone who dared to question his decisions. But this young prosecutor was refusing to be intimidated. History will judge? Harrison's voice was dangerously quiet. Ms. Mitchell, the only thing history will judge is your spectacular failure as a federal prosecutor. Sarah felt the weight of the moment. Every person in the courtroom sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding. The tension was so thick, it seemed to press against the walls of the federal courthouse. Your Honor, I'm prepared to let my work speak for itself. Your work. Harrison's laugh was cold and cruel. Ms. Mitchell, your work so far has consisted of unsubstantiated allegations, improper evidence, and disrespect for judicial authority. If this is the best the U.S. Attorney's Office can produce, then federal law enforcement has reached a new low. In the back of the courtroom, Agent Reeves checked her recording equipment one final time. Everything was being captured. Harrison's obvious bias, his racial animus, his abuse of judicial power. The evidence was overwhelming. Sarah opened the manila folder despite Harrison's previous order to put it away. The financial records inside were explosive. Cancelled checks made out to R. Harrison, in amounts ranging from $50,000 to $200,000, all from known criminal organizations. Your Honor, these financial records show a pattern of payments that I ordered you to put that folder away. Harrison's gavel crashed down repeatedly. Bailiff, remove that evidence from the prosecutor's table. Court Officer James Murphy hesitated. In his 15 years of courtroom duty, he had never seen a judge order evidence to be physically removed from an attorney's possession during a hearing. Sir, I'm not sure I can... Officer Murphy, I gave you a direct order. Harrison's voice cracked with rage. Remove that folder immediately. Murphy looked helplessly between Harrison and Sarah. The legal situation was unprecedented. Federal evidence couldn't simply be confiscated by judicial order without proper legal foundation. Sarah stood firm. Officer Murphy, this evidence is part of an official federal investigation. Any interference with its presentation could constitute obstruction of justice. The warning was clear, and Murphy stepped back. He had no desire to become part of whatever legal disaster was unfolding. Harrison's face contorted with fury. Ms. Mitchell, you are deliberately obstructing the orderly conduct of this court. I'm attempting to present evidence in a federal criminal case, Sarah replied calmly. Evidence that you're using to attack the integrity of this court. Harrison slammed both hands on his bench. I will not tolerate prosecutorial misconduct in my courtroom. Sarah felt the critical moment approaching. Harrison's desperation was becoming more obvious with each exchange. His attempts to suppress evidence, his racial animus, his abuse of authority, everything was being documented for the reckoning that was coming. Your Honor, the integrity of any court is measured by its adherence to the law, not by its suppression of evidence. The statement was like a match thrown into gasoline. Harrison's carefully constructed facade of judicial dignity exploded in a burst of raw fury. "How dare you question this court's integrity?" Harrison roared. "Who do you think you are?" Some affirmative action prosecutor thinks she can waltz in here and lecture a federal judge about the law? The fifth racial reference was accompanied by Harrison rising from his chair, his face twisted with rage. Several spectators in the gallery began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. "Your Honor, I'm not lecturing anyone. You're simply nothing." Harrison's voice echoed off the marble walls. "You're a diversity hire who doesn't belong in federal court. A quota system mistake who thinks her skin color entitles her to disrespect judicial authority." The sixth racial reference was the most blatant yet. In the press section, Chicago Tribune court reporter David Chen stopped taking notes and stared in shock. In 30 years of covering federal courts, he had never witnessed such obvious judicial racism. Sarah felt her composure finally beginning to crack. The man's prejudice was so raw, so ugly, that it took every ounce of her self-control not to reveal her true identity immediately. "Your Honor, my qualifications as a prosecutor are not determined by my race." "Your qualifications?" Harrison laughed bitterly. "Ms. Mitchell, your only qualification is fitting the diversity profile the U.S. Attorney's Office needed to fill their minority quota." Defense Attorney Webb, sensing that his victory was being undermined by Harrison's obvious bias, tried to intervene. "Your Honor, perhaps we could take a brief recess." "Mr. Webb, I don't need legal advice from defense counsel." Harrison snapped. His attention remained fixed on Sarah like a predator focused on prey. "Ms. Mitchell, since you seem incapable of presenting your case competently, let me make this simple for you. Either withdraw these frivolous charges, or I'll dismiss them myself for prosecutorial misconduct." The ultimatum hung in the air like a death sentence. Harrison was demanding that Sarah abandon a major federal corruption case based purely on his personal bias and possible involvement in the crimes being prosecuted. Sarah looked down at the financial records in her folder, records that showed payments totaling over $2 million to Harrison himself. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, and devastating. "Your Honor, I cannot and will not withdraw these charges." Harrison's eyes blazed with triumphant fury. "Then you've made your choice, Ms. Mitchell. Bailiff, I want this prosecutor removed from my courtroom immediately, and I want her arrested for contempt of court." The order to arrest a federal prosecutor sent shockwaves through the packed courtroom. Officer Murphy stood frozen, his hand hovering near his handcuffs as he tried to process the unprecedented command. "Sir, arrest a prosecutor? I need to understand the legal grounds." "The legal grounds are contempt of court," Harrison bellowed. "This prosecutor has deliberately disrupted federal proceedings, shown disrespect for judicial authority, and refused to follow direct court orders." Sarah remained standing at the prosecutor's table, the manila folder still in her hands. Around her, the courtroom had erupted into chaos. Spectators were whispering frantically, defense attorneys were shuffling papers nervously, and the court reporter had stopped transcribing altogether. "Officer Murphy," Sarah said calmly, "I would advise extreme caution before following that order." "Don't you dare give legal advice to my bailiff," Harrison roared. "Officer Murphy, arrest this woman immediately." Murphy looked desperately toward the back of the courtroom, where Agent Torres, still disguised as a security guard, gave him an almost imperceptible shake of the head. Something was very wrong with this situation. "Your Honor," Murphy said carefully, "arresting a federal prosecutor requires specific procedures. I need to contact—" "You need to follow my orders." Harrison's voice cracked with strain. "I am the senior federal judge in this district. When I give an order, you follow it." Sarah felt the trap reaching its final stage. Harrison's desperation was becoming more obvious by the moment. His willingness to arrest a prosecutor for simply presenting evidence revealed the depth of his corruption. "Officer Murphy," she said quietly, "before you take any action, you might want to consider that arresting a federal prosecutor without proper cause could constitute a federal crime." The warning was clear, and Murphy stepped back again. He had no intention of becoming part of whatever legal catastrophe was unfolding. Harrison's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "Ms. Mitchell, you are deliberately obstructing this court's authority." "I'm protecting the integrity of a federal investigation," Sarah replied. Federal investigation. Harrison's voice took on a mocking tone. Ms. Mitchell, the only thing you're investigating is how quickly you can destroy your own career. Sarah opened the manila folder and withdrew a single document, a bank record showing a deposit of $150 into an account registered to Robert Harrison, made just 6 weeks earlier by an organization currently under federal investigation for drug trafficking. Your Honor, this investigation has produced evidence of systematic corruption at the highest levels of the federal judiciary. Harrison's eyes locked onto the document in Sarah's hands. His face went white as he recognized what she was holding. Put that document away immediately, he ordered, his voice suddenly tight with panic. This document shows a payment of $150,000. Bailiff, Harrison screamed, his composure completely shattered. Remove that evidence immediately. That document is illegally obtained. Officer Murphy looked at the document from across the courtroom. Even from his position, he could see Harrison's name clearly printed at the top. Sir, I can't confiscate evidence without proper legal authority. I am the legal authority. Harrison pounded his gavel so hard that the handle cracked. I order you to remove that prosecutor and that evidence from my courtroom right now. Sarah held the document higher, ensuring that everyone in the gallery could see Harrison's name clearly printed across the top. Your Honor, this evidence is part of an official federal investigation into judicial corruption. Get her out. Harrison exploded from behind the bench. Officer Murphy, Officer Davis, remove this woman immediately. Court Officer Patricia Davis, who had been standing near the gallery, reluctantly moved toward the prosecutor's table. Like Murphy, she was deeply uncomfortable with the situation. Ma'am, Davis said quietly, I'm going to need you to come with me. Sarah looked at the two bailiffs approaching her. Both were clearly reluctant to follow Harrison's orders, but they were also trained to obey judicial commands. Officers, before you take any action, I need you to understand that you may be interfering with a federal investigation. Don't listen to her lies, Harrison shouted. She's trying to manipulate you. Remove her now. Davis reached for Sarah's arm, her touch gentle but firm. Ma'am, I'm sorry, but I have to follow the judge's orders. Sarah allowed herself to be guided away from the prosecutor's table, but she kept the bank record visible to everyone in the courtroom. The document was like a smoking gun, clearly showing Harrison's involvement in the corruption network. Your Honor, she said as the bailiffs escorted her toward the door, I want the record to reflect that this court is suppressing evidence of federal crimes. The only crime here is your prosecutorial misconduct, Harrison screamed. His voice was becoming hoarse from shouting. Officer Murphy, I want her handcuffed. Murphy hesitated again. Handcuffing a federal prosecutor was an extreme step that could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Sir, are you absolutely certain? Do it now. As Murphy reluctantly reached for his handcuffs, Sarah felt the moment she had been waiting for finally arrive. Harrison's mask had completely fallen away, revealing the corrupt, prejudiced man beneath the judicial robes. Officers, she said calmly, before you handcuff a federal prosecutor, I strongly advise you to reconsider this course of action. Her voice carried a new tone of authority that made both bailiffs pause. In the gallery, Agent Reeves sat forward in her seat. The moment of revelation was finally at hand. Your Honor, Sarah continued, her voice now carrying the unmistakable tone of command, you are making the biggest mistake of your judicial career. Harrison's face contorted with rage. The only mistake was allowing someone like you into federal court. Sarah reached into her briefcase and withdrew a leather credential case, holding it up for everyone to see. Judge Robert Harrison, she announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. My name is not Sarah Mitchell. The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison's face went from red to white in seconds. My name is Sarah Washington, and I am the Chief Federal Judge for the Northern District of Illinois. The revelation hit courtroom 2506 like a thunderbolt. The silence that followed Sarah's announcement was so complete that the only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning system. Judge Robert Harrison stood frozen behind his bench, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. The gavel fell from his nerveless fingers, clattering onto the judicial desk with a sound that seemed to echo forever. That's impossible, Harrison whispered. his voice barely audible. Sarah held her federal credentials high above her head, the gold badge gleaming under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. Chief Federal Judge Sarah Washington, Northern District of Illinois, appointed by the President of the United States, confirmed by the United States Senate. The credentials were unmistakable, the official seal of the federal judiciary, the presidential signature, the congressional authorization. Every person in the courtroom could see that this was no forgery, no desperate bluff. Officer Murphy's handcuffs clattered to the floor as his hands went limp with shock. "Oh my God," he whispered. "Judge Washington, we almost—" Officer Davis stepped back from Sarah as if she had suddenly caught fire. In 15 years as a federal bailiff, she had never come close to handcuffing a federal judge, especially not the chief judge of the district. Defense attorney Marcus Webb rose slowly from his chair, his face pale with horror. "Your Honor, Chief Judge Washington, I had no idea." Sarah's voice cut through the chaos with judicial authority that brooked no argument. "Mr. Webb, you and your clients have been unwitting participants in a federal investigation. Your cooperation will be noted." Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled croak. "This is some kind of trick, some kind of elaborate fraud." "No fraud, Judge Harrison." Sarah's tone was ice cold. "What you've witnessed today is the culmination of Operation Clean Bench, a 2-year federal investigation into judicial corruption in the Northern District of Illinois." The words sent a shockwave through the gallery. Operation Clean Bench was a name that would soon be on the front page of every newspaper in America, but for now, it was the first time most people in the courtroom had heard it. "For the past 8 months," Sarah continued, "I have been working undercover as Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Mitchell, documenting systematic corruption, bribery, and abuse of judicial power." Harrison's legs seemed to give way beneath him, and he collapsed back into his chair. No. This can't be happening." "Every word you've spoken today has been recorded," Sarah announced. "Every racial slur, every abuse of authority, every attempt to suppress evidence, all of it preserved for posterity." She gestured toward the gallery, where Agent Reeves was now standing with her FBI credentials clearly visible. "Special Agent Patricia Reeves, Federal Bureau of Investigation. She's been recording everything from the gallery." Agent Torres, no longer disguising himself as a security guard, stepped forward from his position near the door. "Special Agent David Torres, FBI. The entire courtroom has been under federal surveillance." Harrison's head swiveled back and forth between the two agents, his eyes wide with terror. "Surveillance? You've been watching me." "Judge Harrison," Sarah said, her voice carrying the full weight of federal judicial authority. "You have been under investigation for 15 months. Today's performance was simply the final piece of evidence we needed." The manila folder that had caused so much controversy was now open on the prosecutor's table, its contents spread out for everyone to see. Bank records, cancelled checks, wire transfers, a paper trail of corruption that stretched back 15 years. "The evidence you were so desperate to suppress," Sarah continued, "documents payments totaling over $2 million from criminal organizations directly into your personal accounts." Harrison's face was now completely white. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air-conditioned courtroom. "Those records, they're fabricated. They have to be." "DNA evidence from the cancelled checks confirms your signature," Agent Reeves announced from the gallery. "Handwriting analysis confirms the endorsements. Bank surveillance footage shows you personally depositing several of the larger checks." The web of evidence was closing around Harrison like a noose. Every avenue of denial was being systematically eliminated. Sarah approached Harrison's bench with the measured stride of judicial authority. "Judge Robert Harrison, in addition to your documented corruption, you have committed multiple federal crimes in this courtroom today." Harrison looked up at her with the expression of a trapped animal. "What crimes? I haven't committed any crimes." "Assault on a federal officer," Sarah enumerated. "When you struck me during your tantrum, you committed a federal felony punishable by up to 20 years in prison." Harrison's hand unconsciously moved to the judicial ring that had cut Sarah's lip. The evidence of his violence was still visible on her face. Obstruction of justice, Sarah continued. Your attempts to suppress federal evidence constitute a separate felony charge. Civil rights violations under color of authority, Agent Torres added. Your racial animus and discriminatory conduct violate multiple federal statutes. And most seriously, Sarah said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, judicial corruption. Accepting bribes while wearing the robes of a federal judge is not just a crime, Judge Harrison. It's a betrayal of every principle this courthouse represents. Harrison slumped forward in his chair, the weight of his crimes finally crushing down on him. 20 years of corruption, 2 decades of abuse, a lifetime of prejudice, all of it now exposed under the harsh lights of federal justice. But Judge Harrison, Sarah said, her voice now carrying a note of grim satisfaction, your biggest mistake wasn't the corruption. It wasn't even the racism. She leaned closer to his bench, her words carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. Your biggest mistake was laying hands on the chief federal judge of this district. The impact of Sarah's final statement hung in the air like a death sentence. Harrison's face had gone beyond pale. He looked like a man who had just seen his own grave being dug. Chief Judge Washington, he whispered, his voice shaking. Please, there's been a misunderstanding. Sarah's expression was carved from granite. The only misunderstanding, Judge Harrison, was your belief that you could abuse your authority without consequences. She turned toward the gallery, where more FBI agents were now revealing themselves. Agent Michael Rodriguez, who had been posing as a court clerk, stepped forward with a folder thick with legal documents. Judge Harrison, Agent Rodriguez announced, I have here a federal arrest warrant issued by Chief Judge Washington herself, countersigned by the U.S. Attorney General. The warrant was official, bearing the seal of the United States Department of Justice. Harrison's name was typed clearly across the top, followed by a list of charges that read like a criminal prosecutor's dream: corruption, bribery, obstruction of justice, civil rights violations, assault on a federal officer. Furthermore, Sarah added, I have here a judicial emergency order removing you from the federal bench, effective immediately. She produced a second document, this one bearing the signature of the Chief Justice of the United States. Harrison's judicial authority, the power he had abused for 20 years, was being stripped away with the stroke of a pen. Defense Attorney Webb, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally managed to speak. Chief Judge Washington, what about our clients? What happens to their case? Sarah's expression softened slightly when she looked at Webb. Mr. Webb, your clients are the victims of judicial corruption. This case will be reassigned to an honest judge, and your clients will receive the fair hearing that Judge Harrison denied them. She gestured toward the 3 police officers who'd been sitting at the defendant's table throughout the morning's drama. Officers Torres, Chen, and Martinez, you stand accused of serious crimes, but you also have the right to a fair trial before an impartial judge, something you would never have received in Judge Harrison's courtroom. The 3 defendants looked confused and terrified. They had expected their trial to be a mere formality, with Harrison's corruption ensuring their acquittal. Now they faced the prospect of real justice. As for the evidence of the larger corruption network, Sarah continued, that investigation is ongoing. Every judge, every clerk, every court official who participated in this system will be held accountable. Agent Reeves stepped forward with her own set of documents. Judge Harrison, we also have evidence of your involvement in Operation Blind Scale, a separate investigation into the systematic fixing of federal cases. Harrison's head jerked up. Operation Blind Scale? What are you talking about? The 16 federal cases you fixed over the past 3 years, Agent Torres explained. Drug dealers who walked free, embezzlers who received suspended sentences, violent criminals who were released on technicalities, all because someone paid you the right amount. Sarah moved closer to Harrison's bench, her presence now radiating the full authority of her position. Judge Harrison, your corruption didn't just pervert justice in your own courtroom. It undermined the entire federal judicial system. Harrison tried one last desperate plea. Judge Washington, Sarah, surely we can work something out. I have information about other judges, other corruption. Sarah's expression hardened. Judge Harrison, After what I witnessed today, the racism, the abuse of power, the assault on a federal officer, there is no deal. There is no working anything out. She gestured toward Officers Murphy and Davis, who were still standing in shock near the bailiff's station. Officers, you are hereby directed to place former Judge Robert Harrison under arrest. Murphy looked confused. Ma'am, Your Honor, are you sure we should— Officer Murphy. Sarah's voice carried absolute command authority. I am the chief federal judge of this district. I am ordering you to arrest Robert Harrison for multiple federal crimes committed in my presence. Davis moved first, her training overriding her shock. Robert Harrison, you are under arrest for federal crimes committed in this courtroom. As the handcuffs clicked around Harrison's wrists, the sound seemed to echo through the courthouse like a funeral bell. The man who had wielded absolute power for 20 years was now experiencing justice from the other side. You have the right to remain silent, Davis continued with the Miranda warning. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Harrison looked up at Sarah with eyes filled with desperation. This isn't over, Washington. You think you've won, but there are others. There are judges higher than you who— Judge Harrison, Sarah interrupted. Your threats are being recorded. I suggest you exercise your right to remain silent. Agent Rodriguez stepped forward with additional paperwork. Chief Judge Washington, we also have search warrants for Harrison's home, his office, and his bank safety deposit boxes. Execute them immediately, Sarah ordered. I want every piece of evidence secured before word of this arrest spreads. As Harrison was led away in handcuffs, still wearing his judicial robes, Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction at seeing justice finally served, but sadness at how far the corruption had spread through the system she had devoted her life to protecting. Ladies and gentlemen, she announced to the packed courtroom, court is adjourned. Justice has been served. But even as Harrison disappeared through the courtroom doors, Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The evidence they had gathered would lead to more arrests, more corruption exposed, more judges removed from the bench. The courtroom remained in stunned silence even after Harrison's removal. Sarah stood at the prosecutor's table, still holding her federal credentials, as the magnitude of what had just occurred sank in for everyone present. Chicago Tribune reporter David Chen was the first to break the silence. Chief Judge Washington, can you tell us how long this investigation has been ongoing? Sarah looked at the reporter, recognizing that the story was about to explode across national media. Mr. Chen, Operation Clean Bench has been active for 24 months. What you witnessed today was the culmination of the most extensive federal judicial corruption investigation in American history. Agent Reeves joined Sarah at the front of the courtroom, her FBI credentials now prominently displayed. The investigation involved 17 federal agencies, including the FBI, U.S. Marshals Service, and the Department of Justice Office of Inspector General. How many judges are involved? Asked Maria Santos from the Chicago Sun-Times. The investigation is ongoing. Sarah replied carefully, but I can tell you that today's arrest is the first of many. The corruption we've uncovered extends far beyond Judge Harrison. Agent Torres, no longer concealing his identity, approached with a thick briefing folder. Chief Judge Washington, we've received confirmation that the search warrants are being executed simultaneously at 17 locations across Chicago. The scope of the operation was becoming clear. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was about dismantling an entire network of judicial corruption that had infected the federal court system. Defense Attorney Webb, still processing the morning's revelations, raised his hand hesitantly. Your Honor, what happens to the cases that Judge Harrison was handling? Are they all compromised? Sarah nodded grimly. Mr. Webb, that's an excellent question. Every case handled by Judge Harrison over the past 15 years will need to be reviewed. Cases where corruption is suspected will be retried before honest judges. The implication was staggering. Hundreds of federal cases, thousands of defendants, millions of dollars in judgments, all potentially tainted by Harrison's corruption. The Department of Justice is establishing a special corruption review panel, Agent Rodriguez announced. Every Harrison decision will be examined for evidence of bias or bribery. Court reporter Margaret Klein, who had been documenting federal proceedings for 3 decades, looked up from her stenotype machine. Your Honor, in 30 years of court reporting, I've never seen anything like this. How did the corruption go undetected for so long? Sarah's expression darkened. Ms. Klein, the corruption persisted because it was protected by a network of complicit officials. Judges protected other judges. Court administrators looked the other way. The system became self-protecting. She gestured toward the evidence still spread across the prosecutor's table. But technology changed the game. Electronic banking records, digital communications, surveillance equipment, corruption became harder to hide. Agent Reeves activated a laptop computer, projecting images onto the courtroom's display screen. Bank records, wire transfers, and cancelled checks filled the projection, creating a visual web of corruption. This is just Harrison's network, she explained. 17 judges, 43 court personnel, and dozens of criminal defendants who paid for favorable treatment. The numbers were staggering. The projected evidence showed payments totaling over $50 million spread across the corruption network. Judge Harrison personally received over $2 million in bribes, Sarah added, but he was actually small-scale compared to some of the others we've identified. Public defender Lisa Martinez, who represented many defendants in Harrison's court, stood up with obvious emotion. Your Honor, how many innocent people went to prison because they couldn't afford to pay bribes? How many guilty people walked free because they could? Sarah's voice carried deep sadness as she answered. Ms. Martinez, that's exactly why this investigation was necessary. We estimate that Harrison's corruption affected over 800 federal cases. The human cost was becoming clear. 800 cases meant thousands of lives affected by judicial corruption. Innocent people imprisoned, criminals freed, families destroyed by perverted justice. The Innocence Review Commission is already working with our office, Agent Torres announced. We're prioritizing cases where innocent defendants may have been wrongly convicted. Agent Rodriguez approached with an urgent message. Chief Judge Washington, we're receiving reports from the field teams. The Harrison residence search has uncovered significant evidence, additional bank records, communications with criminal organizations, and what appears to be a master list of corrupted officials. Sarah nodded grimly. How extensive is the list? Preliminary count shows 47 names, including federal judges, state judges, prosecutors, and court administrators. The scope of corruption was even worse than they had feared. 47 officials represented a systematic infection of the judicial system that would take years to fully address. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah announced to the courtroom, what you've witnessed today is just the beginning. Operation Clean Bench will continue until every corrupt official is removed from office and prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. She looked directly at the reporters in the gallery. The American people deserve a judicial system they can trust. Today we began the process of restoring that trust. Agent Reeves stepped forward with final updates from the field teams. Chief Judge Washington, we have confirmations on 6 additional arrest warrants being executed as we speak. The investigation was moving with military precision. While Harrison was being processed at the federal detention facility, teams of agents were simultaneously arresting his co-conspirators across the city. Judge Patricia Chen, no relation to defendant Chen, has been arrested at her Oak Park residence, Agent Rodriguez reported. Judge Michael Torres, also no relation to defendant Torres, was taken into custody at the Palmer House Hotel during lunch with a known criminal defense attorney. Sarah felt a mixture of triumph and tragedy. Justice was being served. But the corruption had reached so deeply into the system that its removal would leave scars for years to come. The federal courthouse had transformed into a command center for the largest judicial corruption investigation in American history. FBI agents moved through the hallways with purpose, executing search warrants and securing evidence from 17 different locations across the building. Sarah stood in the chief judge's office, her real office, surrounded by maps, computer screens, and evidence boards that looked like something from a crime thriller. Agent Reeves was coordinating with field teams, while Agent Torres managed the media response that was already spiraling into a national story. Chief Judge Washington, Agent Rodriguez reported, we have confirmation on 9 arrests so far. Judge Harrison is being processed at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. His arraignment is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Sarah nodded, reviewing the arrest reports that were streaming in from field teams. Each arrest represented years of corrupted justice finally being addressed. "What about Judge Patricia Chen?" she asked. "Arrested without incident at her residence," Rodriguez replied. "She was actually packing when our team arrived. Apparently someone tipped her off that the operation was underway." Sarah frowned. "Someone inside the courthouse warned her." "We're investigating, but yes, it appears that word of Harrison's arrest spread quickly through the judicial network." The possibility of an information leak was troubling but not unexpected. The corruption network had survived for 15 years by protecting its members. It made sense that they would have early warning systems in place. Agent Torres approached with updates from the media management team. "Chief Judge Washington, the story is breaking nationally. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC. They're all leading with federal judge arrested for corruption. The Associated Press is calling it the biggest judicial scandal since Alcee Hastings." Sarah had anticipated the media storm. A federal judge being arrested in his own courtroom was unprecedented. The story would dominate news cycles for weeks. "What's our media strategy?" she asked. "Department of Justice is scheduling a press conference for 6 p.m., Torres replied. "Attorney General Morrison wants you to lead the briefing, with FBI Director Chen providing operational details." The press conference would be Sarah's first public appearance, as both victim and chief investigator of the corruption network. The story was compelling. A federal judge going undercover to expose corruption, only to be physically attacked by the corrupt judge she was investigating. Agent Reeves looked up from her communications console. "Chief Judge Washington, we're getting reports from the Harrison residence search. The evidence is extraordinary." She activated the main display screen, showing digital photographs from Harrison's home office. The images revealed a sophisticated operation, multiple computers, encrypted communication devices, and filing cabinets filled with case records. Harrison kept detailed records of every bribe, every fixed case, every corrupt transaction, Reeves explained. "It's like he was maintaining a ledger of judicial corruption." Sarah studied the evidence images with growing amazement. "He documented everything." "Everything," Rodriguez confirmed. "Case numbers, bribe amounts, criminal organizations involved, even photographs of some transactions. It's a prosecutor's dream." The irony was striking. Harrison's obsessive record-keeping, probably intended to protect himself through mutual blackmail, had instead created the perfect evidence trail for federal prosecutors. "There's more," Agent Torres added. "We found Harrison's communications with Judge Michael Torres, the other Torres, not me, discussing specific case outcomes. They were literally negotiating the price of justice through encrypted messages." Sarah shook her head in disgust. "How much money are we talking about?" "Preliminary estimates suggest the network generated over $50 million in corrupt payments over 15 years, Reeves reported. Harrison personally received $2.3 million, but Judge Torres appears to have been the biggest earner at over $6 million. The scope of financial corruption was staggering, but Sarah knew the real damage wasn't measured in dollars. It was measured in perverted justice, destroyed lives, and broken trust in the judicial system. Agent Rodriguez approached with urgent news. "Chief Judge Washington, we have a problem. Judge Michael Torres hasn't been located. His residence is empty, his car is gone, and his bank accounts were cleaned out yesterday." Sarah felt a chill of concern. "He's running. It appears so. We've issued a federal warrant and contacted U.S. Marshals, but he has a 12-hour head start." The possibility of corrupt judges fleeing justice added a new urgency to the investigation. If other members of the network realized the extent of the evidence against them, more might attempt to escape. "Issue BOLO alerts for all remaining targets," Sarah ordered. "I don't want any of these criminals escaping to non-extradition countries." Agent Torres received an incoming call, spoke briefly, then turned to the group with grave news. "Chief Judge Washington, we have confirmation that Judge Patricia Morales, the judge who signed many of our search warrants, has received death threats." Sarah's blood ran cold. Judge Morales had been one of the few completely honest judges in the district, which made her a target for the corruption network's retaliation. "What kind of threats?" "Anonymous calls to her residence and courthouse office. The callers knew details about her family, her home address, her daily routine. U.S. Marshals are providing protection, but we're concerned about escalation. The corruption network was fighting back, using intimidation and violence to protect itself. Sarah realized that exposing the corruption was only the first step. Dismantling it would require protecting honest officials from criminal retaliation. "Double the security for all clean judges," she ordered, "and accelerate the remaining arrests. The longer these criminals remain free, the more dangerous they become." Agent Reeves nodded grimly. "Chief Judge Washington, we're dealing with people who have controlled the justice system for 15 years. They won't surrender without a fight." Sarah looked out the window of her office, where federal agents were still executing search warrants throughout the courthouse. The battle for judicial integrity was just beginning. The Department of Justice press conference at 6 p.m. drew national attention. Sarah stood behind the podium in the DOJ's main briefing room, flanked by FBI Director Chen and Attorney General Morrison. The room was packed with reporters from every major news organization in America. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the weight of the day's revelations, "today marked the end of the most extensive judicial corruption investigation in federal history. Operation Clean Bench has resulted in 9 arrests so far, with more expected in the coming days." The assembled reporters erupted in questions, but Sarah continued with her prepared statement. "For 24 months, federal agents worked undercover to document systematic corruption that infected the Northern District of Illinois federal court system." She gestured toward the evidence displays that had been arranged around the briefing room, photographs, bank records, and organizational charts that revealed the scope of the corruption network. "The evidence we've gathered shows that 17 federal judges, along with dozens of court personnel, participated in a bribery scheme that perverted justice in hundreds of cases." NBC correspondent Jessica Williams raised her hand. "Chief Judge Washington, can you explain how you personally became involved in the undercover operation?" Sarah had anticipated this question. The story of a sitting federal judge going undercover was unprecedented and would dominate headlines for weeks. 18 months ago, we received credible intelligence about systematic corruption in federal courts. Rather than conduct a traditional investigation that might be compromised by corrupt insiders, I made the decision to personally infiltrate the network." She paused, allowing the magnitude of that decision to sink in. "For 8 months, I assumed the identity of Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Mitchell, working directly with corrupt judges to document their criminal activities." CNN's legal correspondent David Martinez asked the obvious follow-up question. "Chief Judge Washington, wasn't this operation extraordinarily dangerous? What if your cover had been blown?" Sarah's expression grew serious. "Mr. Martinez, the operation was indeed dangerous, but the corruption we were investigating represented a clear and present danger to the American justice system. Sometimes, extraordinary crimes require extraordinary investigative measures." FBI Director Chen stepped forward to provide operational details. "The investigation involved 17 federal agencies and generated over 40,000 hours of surveillance recordings. We have documented evidence of systematic bribery, case-fixing, and obstruction of justice." Attorney General Morrison addressed the broader implications. "This investigation demonstrates the Department of Justice's absolute commitment to judicial integrity. No one, regardless of their position or authority, is above the law." A reporter from the Washington Post asked about the scope of case reviews. "Mr. Morrison, how many federal cases will need to be reviewed or potentially retried?" "We estimate that approximately 800 federal cases may have been affected by judicial corruption," Morrison replied. "The department is establishing a special review commission to examine each case and determine appropriate remedies." Sarah returned to the podium to address the human impact. "The victims of this corruption include everyone who appeared before these corrupt judges. Defendants who didn't receive fair trials, prosecutors who saw criminals walk free, and families whose faith in justice was betrayed." She looked directly into the television cameras. "To those victims, I want to say that your government failed you, but today we began the process of making it right." The questions continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from the investigation's origins to its future implications. Sarah answered each one with the measured authority of her judicial position, but also with the passion of someone who had personally witnessed the corruption's ugly reality. After the press conference, Sarah returned to her office at the federal courthouse, where the investigation continued around the clock. Agent Reeves greeted her with updates from the ongoing operations. "Chief Judge Washington, we've executed search warrants at 23 locations today. The evidence recovery is extraordinary." She gestured toward tables covered with seized materials, computers, files, bank records, and communications equipment that revealed the corruption network's full scope. "Judge Michael Torres is still at large, but we've frozen his assets and contacted international law enforcement. If he tries to leave the country, we'll know about it." Agent Rodriguez approached with news about the other arrested judges. "Judge Patricia Chen has agreed to cooperate with the investigation. She's providing details about the network's operations and identifying other participants." Sarah nodded grimly. "What about Judge Harrison? Still in federal custody, still claiming innocence despite overwhelming evidence. His attorney is requesting a psychiatric evaluation, arguing that the stress of exposure caused a mental breakdown." Sarah recalled Harrison's violent behavior in the courtroom, the racial slurs, the physical assault, the desperate attempts to suppress evidence. Whether it was mental illness or simply revealed character, his actions had destroyed any remaining credibility. "Have we identified who leaked information about the operation to Judge Chen?" "We're analyzing phone records and email communications," Agent Torres reported. "The leak appears to have come from within the courthouse, possibly someone in the clerk's office." The possibility of ongoing security breaches was troubling. The corruption network had survived for 15 years by protecting its members. Dismantling those protective mechanisms would require careful investigation. Agent Reeves activated the main display screen, showing a map of Chicago with arrest locations marked in red. 9 arrests completed, with warrants outstanding for 6 additional judges and 12 court personnel. Sarah studied the map, realizing that each red marker represented years of perverted justice finally being addressed. The investigation had reached a critical mass. The corruption network was collapsing under the weight of its own documented crimes. "What's our timeline for completing the arrests?" she asked. 48 hours for most domestic targets," Rodriguez replied. "International fugitives like Judge Torres may take longer." Sarah looked out the window of her office, where the Chicago skyline stretched toward Lake Michigan. Somewhere in that vast city, corrupt judges were probably destroying evidence, liquidating assets, and planning their escapes. But the investigation had reached a point of no return. The evidence was overwhelming, the documentation was comprehensive, and the justice system was finally fighting back against its own corruption. 6 months after Harrison's arrest, Sarah stood once again in a federal courtroom, but this time she wore her judicial robes with renewed pride. The corruption trials had concluded with devastating results for the criminal network. 17 judges convicted, 43 court personnel sentenced, and over 200 criminal cases overturned or retried. Judge Robert Harrison had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, the maximum possible under federal corruption statutes. His final statement to the court had been a rambling, incoherent rant about racial quotas and affirmative action, revealing that his prejudice remained unchanged even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Judge Michael Torres, the network's biggest earner, had been captured in Costa Rica after a 3-month international manhunt. His $6 million in corrupt proceeds had been seized and returned to the federal treasury, while Torres himself faced life in prison under federal organized crime statutes. But perhaps most importantly, the Innocence Review Commission had identified 43 defendants who had been wrongfully convicted due to judicial corruption. Sarah had personally presided over their exonerations, watching as men and women walked free after years of unjust imprisonment. Today she was addressing the annual meeting of the Federal Judges Association, speaking to hundreds of judges from across the country about the lessons learned from Operation Clean Bench. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, looking out at the assembled federal judiciary, "the events of the past year have reminded us that judicial integrity is not automatic. It must be actively protected, continuously monitored, and rigorously enforced. The audience included many judges who had been deeply shaken by the corruption revelations. The federal judiciary had always prided itself on its integrity, but Operation Clean Bench had revealed systematic flaws that allowed corruption to flourish undetected. The corruption network succeeded because it operated in secrecy, protected by mutual blackmail and institutional loyalty. Corrupt judges protected each other, creating a closed system that excluded oversight and accountability. Sarah gestured toward a display screen showing statistics from the investigation. $50 million in corrupt payments, 800 compromised cases, 17 destroyed judicial careers. These numbers represent the cost of looking the other way when colleagues exhibit suspicious behavior. Chief Judge Margaret Rodriguez of the Southern District of Texas raised her hand. Chief Judge Washington, what systemic changes are being implemented to prevent future corruption? Sarah had anticipated this question. It was the heart of everything they had learned from the investigation. Judge Rodriguez, we're implementing several key reforms. First, mandatory financial disclosure for all federal judges, with annual audits conducted by independent investigators. Second, random case reassignment protocols that prevent judges from controlling their own dockets. Third, enhanced surveillance of judicial communications and financial transactions. The reforms were controversial. Many judges viewed them as intrusive and distrustful. But Sarah knew that trust had to be earned back through transparency and accountability. Judge William Chen of the Eastern District of California expressed the concerns of many colleagues. Chief Judge Washington, don't these measures assume that federal judges are criminals until proven otherwise? Sarah's response was firm but understanding. Judge Chen, these measures assume that federal judges are human beings susceptible to temptation, pressure, and corruption. The reforms acknowledge reality rather than pretending that judicial appointments confer moral immunity. She clicked to the next slide, showing comparative corruption statistics from other judicial systems around the world. Every major judicial system has faced corruption scandals. What distinguishes successful reforms is the willingness to implement strong oversight mechanisms that prevent corruption, rather than simply punishing it after the fact. Judge Patricia Williams of the District of Columbia asked about the ongoing case reviews. Chief Judge Washington, what's the status of the 800 potentially compromised cases? Judge Williams, the Special Review Commission has completed its analysis of all affected cases. 237 cases have been overturned due to documented corruption. 112 defendants have been released from prison. 43 individuals have been completely exonerated. The human cost of judicial corruption was staggering, but Sarah took some satisfaction in knowing that justice was finally being served, even if it came years late for many victims. Agent Reeves, who had been promoted to Assistant Director of the FBI's Judicial Security Division, provided an update on the ongoing investigations. Operation Clean Bench has spawned 17 related investigations in other federal districts. We've identified potential corruption networks in 6 additional circuits, with preliminary evidence suggesting that the Chicago network was part of a larger national pattern. The revelation that judicial corruption might be even more widespread than initially believed sent a murmur through the assembled judges. Sarah had feared this possibility, that Chicago was not an isolated incident, but part of a systemic problem. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah concluded, the federal judiciary faces a choice. We can either embrace the transparency and accountability that will restore public trust, or we can resist change and watch our credibility continue to erode. She looked directly at the television cameras that were broadcasting her speech to a national audience. To the American people who are watching this broadcast, I want to make you a promise. The federal judiciary will earn back your trust through our actions, not our words. We will be transparent in our operations, accountable for our decisions, and relentless in our pursuit of justice. Sarah paused, letting her words sink in before delivering her final message. But I also want you to remember something else. What you witnessed 6 months ago in that Chicago courtroom wasn't just about corruption. It was about the power of persistence, courage, and unwavering commitment to justice. When systems fail, Individuals must step forward to fix them. She gestured toward Agent Reeves, who was sitting in the front row. The FBI agents who worked on Operation Clean Bench risked their careers to expose corruption. The honest judges who provided information risked retaliation from their corrupt colleagues. The court reporters who documented evidence risked their jobs to preserve the truth. The camera pulled back to show the entire auditorium of federal judges, all listening intently to Sarah's words. And yes, I risked my life going undercover to document judicial corruption firsthand, because sometimes extraordinary crimes require extraordinary measures to combat them. Sarah's voice grew stronger, filled with the passion that had driven her through 8 months of dangerous undercover work. Judge Robert Harrison believed that his position made him untouchable. He believed that wearing judicial robes gave him the right to abuse anyone who appeared in his courtroom. He believed that his prejudice could be disguised as legal authority. She looked directly into the camera, speaking to the millions of Americans watching the broadcast. Judge Harrison was wrong. No one, absolutely no one, is above the law in America. Not judges, not politicians, not billionaires, not celebrities. The law applies equally to every person, regardless of their position, their wealth, or their connections. The auditorium erupted in applause, with hundreds of federal judges rising to their feet. The standing ovation continued for nearly 2 minutes, reflecting the judiciary's commitment to the reforms Sarah had championed. As the applause died down, Sarah delivered her closing remarks. 6 months ago, Judge Harrison made the mistake of physically assaulting what he thought was a powerless prosecutor. What he discovered was that in America, there are no powerless prosecutors, only prosecutors whose power hasn't been fully revealed yet. She smiled slightly, remembering the moment when Harrison's face went white as she revealed her true identity. Today, former Judge Harrison is serving a 25-year federal sentence. His corruption network has been completely dismantled. The judges he corrupted are either in prison or banned from the federal bench forever. Sarah's expression grew serious one final time. But the most important result of Operation Clean Bench isn't the number of corrupt officials we imprisoned. It's the restoration of faith in American justice. It's the knowledge that our system, while imperfect, can still correct itself when dedicated people fight for what's right. She looked out at the assembled judges, then back at the cameras. To everyone who believes in justice, who fights for truth, who refuses to accept corruption as inevitable, remember that your voice matters, your courage counts, your persistence can change the world. Sarah stepped back from the podium as the auditorium erupted in another standing ovation. The federal judiciary was committing itself to the reforms that would prevent another corruption scandal like the one that had nearly destroyed public faith in the courts. 1 year after Operation Clean Bench, Sarah received a letter that would stay with her forever. It was from Marcus Johnson, a 23-year-old man who had spent 4 years in federal prison for a drug crime he didn't commit, a victim of Judge Harrison's corruption network. Chief Judge Washington, the letter began, I want you to know that when I walked out of that prison as a free man, the first thing I did was cry. Not because of the 4 years I lost, but because someone finally cared enough to fight for the truth. Marcus had been convicted in Harrison's courtroom after his family couldn't afford the bribes that would have secured his acquittal. His case was one of the 43 complete exonerations that resulted from the Innocence Review Commission. I don't know if I'll ever get those 4 years back, Marcus wrote. But I know that because of what you did, other innocent people won't have to go through what I went through. The letter continued. My little sister is starting law school next year. She says she wants to be like you, someone who fights for justice even when it's dangerous. I told her that heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear judges' robes and risk everything to do what's right. Sarah kept that letter framed on her office wall, a reminder of why Operation Clean Bench had been necessary and why the fight for judicial integrity would never end. Thank you to everyone who typed justice and shared your locations with us throughout this incredible story. Seeing this global community united for accountability and truth proves that justice is indeed a universal human value. The courage shown by Chief Judge Washington reminds us that real change happens when individuals refuse to accept corruption and abuse of power. From Chicago to London, From Tokyo to São Paulo, from Sydney to Lagos, people everywhere stand for the principle that no one is above the law. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more incredible tales of ordinary people doing extraordinary things to fight injustice. These stories matter because they remind us that heroism isn't about superpowers, it's about moral courage in the face of overwhelming odds. Until next time, remember Chief Judge Sarah Washington's words. Sometimes extraordinary crimes require extraordinary measures to combat them. In a world where corruption often seems inevitable, never forget that dedicated individuals can still change everything. Justice isn't just an ideal, it's a choice we make every single day.